Tonight we have the pleasure of welcoming as our speaker Charlotte Horlyck, reader in the history of Korean art and head of the School of Arts at SOAS University of London. Dr. Horlyck has written on Korean art from ancient times to the present, and I eagerly look forward to drawing upon her 2017 book, Korean Art from the 19th Century to the Present, at some point when I teach history of East Asian art in the future. The title of tonight's talk is Mining the Archive for Collecting Histories of Korean Art. Dr. Horlyck will speak for about 1 hour, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A. And with that, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I will share my screen. And whilst I talk, I will stop my video. So I will just stop my video now. Let's do like that, and I'll share my screen and do like this. Excellent. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you also to the Ditsumekan for inviting me as a visiting fellow this week at the Ditsumekan. It's a great pleasure to be here. And in particular, I thank Professor Yano for initiating that along with his colleagues. So my talk today merges my past and current research interest in pre-modern and modern Korean material culture. As Professor Seifman said, the content of my talk forms part of my recent publication on the emergence of the Korean art market, and which came out last year. Or at the end of last year, when working on the book, I relied very heavily on archival material in the UK and America, and in particular, the Freer and Sackler archives in the National Museum of Art, Washington, D.C., in particular the Charles Lang Freer papers, were instrumental to furthering my research due to the detailed records it has from the late 19th century onwards. And it's for this reason that I titled the talk, Mining the Archive for Collecting Histories of Korean Art, because I know that here at the ARC in the Ditsumekan, you do all this wonderful work on creating digital archives. And of course, it in itself is such a valuable tool for researchers. Now, a large part of the Charles Lang Freer papers have been digitized, but in 2008, when I carried out research in Washington, D.C., supported by a Smithsonian Institution grant, not all of the archive had been digitized. In fact, most of it had not. And instead, I was granted direct access to this huge volume of different types of papers. I also used the American Art Archives. The photographs you see there on your left are what's called pocket diaries from the early 20th century, belonging to a very important American collector called Fitzgerald. In general, this kind of archival material enabled me detailed insights into the emergence of the Korean art market between the 1870s and the 1930s. So, drawing on this archival material, my talk today centers on the collection of Charles Lang Freer, the founder of the Smithsonian Institution's Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Freer was a pioneering individual whose collection of Western and Asian art was the most extensive of his time. And that includes his collection of Korean artifacts, which you see here on display in the Freer Gallery of Art and the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery in what has since been renamed. The name of the new museum is the National Museum of Asian Art. I'm looking at
Yes.
at Dr. Seifman to see if that's correct. His Korean artifacts he began to acquire in 1896, culminating in 450 objects. And the collection is significant not only for its size and the quality of the ceramics, but also because Freer's collecting activities exemplify the rising interest in Korean art in the early 20th century. So in my talk today, I will discuss the beginnings and his acquisitions present insights into the collecting activities of Korean art, including the availability of antiques, the development of scholarship on Korean cultural heritage, individual and institutional motivations for collecting Korean art, and also, and this is in particular relevant because I'm now giving this talk here in Japan, the relationship between the interest in Japanese art and Korean art, that of course are related to the time of collecting. This is, as you know, in the early 20th century was of course when the Japanese Empire was preparing to take over the Korean Peninsula, which happened in 1910. So that political relationship also, of course, in various ways shaped the art market. Nowadays, these kinds of ceramics from the Joseon dynasty are widely regarded as a quintessential Korean artifact. This is what's called a moon jar these days in contemporary terminology. And they were very popular also actually here in Japan, in particular collectors such as Yanagi Muniyoshi wrote about these kinds of jars. But in the early 20th century, it was audio celadon ceramics that were understood to be a so-called distinctively Korean expression of taste and skill, as noted at the time in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And indeed, over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century, hundreds of these kinds of ceramics were discovered and collected, including this very delicately decorated cup and cup stand, which were purchased directly in Seoul by Mr. Wilde, who was a curator at the V&A Museum in London. He traveled to Seoul in 1911 and bought them from a dealer. Mr. Wilde, maybe this will be of interest, but he was actually the head of the ceramics department at the V&A at the time. So as I said, Freer's collection of Korean ceramics is among the best in Europe and America in terms of size and quality. And that, of course, then leads us to the question as to who was Freer and why was he significant? I mean, no doubt, many of you will already be aware of some of his activities. Maybe here in Japan, Freer's interest in Japan is best known. But as I said, he was really one of the earliest collectors of Korean art who had a very conscious, ambitious aim to build the best collections of Korean art of his time. And this is really interesting, that he voiced this so openly. I want to build the best collection. Because of course, therefore, it gives us an insight into why he collected certain pieces over a particular period. So in this way, Freer is really very different from many other collectors. In many respects, he was a pioneer, as his keenness to acquire high-quality Korean artifacts came at a time when the field of Korean art was only beginning in America and Europe. For example, when he collected, there was relatively little research on Korean art. For example, the book you see here, which was authored by a German individual who lived in Korea for many years. This was not published until 1929. Andreas Eckert first wrote the book in German, and it was then published into English. So you can see this was the first comprehensive volume on Korean art in English. And this was published only after Freer's death. So I think that gives you an insight into how new the field was at the time. But what's also noteworthy is that Freer's interest in Korean art is very much shaped by broader cultural and social trends of his time. So for this reason, I think he's very interesting to study. And in addition to that, the fact that his archive is so comprehensive and it's accessible to scholars means that it's possible to build up quite a detailed story, detailed insights into what he collected, when, how much it cost, etc., etc. And this is actually quite rare. So Freer was born in Kingston, New York. He left school at 14 to begin to work in a cement factory. And then at 18, he began to work in the Ulster and Delaware Railroad Company. And this was really very fortunate because he came at this company, he met this individual, Colonel Frank Hecker, who was the superintendent. His encounter with Hecker came to shape Freer's life. As 2 years later, the two became business partners, and they succeeded in building an extremely successful company that manufactured railroad rolling stock. This, of course, was the time in America when business was booming everywhere, and in particular, those who invested in railroads, newspapers, actually, they really made a huge fortune. Hecker and Freer also became very, very close friends. And in the Freer archive are so many letters, hundreds of letters that Freer wrote to Hecker from his travels and so on and so on. So that too offers insights into Freer's mind, because Freer, for example, would also write to Hecker about some of the artworks that he collected, the people he met, what he felt about them, and so on and so on. Freer retired from the company already in 1899 after he amassed a considerable fortune. And after this time, he devoted himself to his art collection. So he really became a full-time collector, studying the artworks, collecting them, meeting the dealers. And Freer was essentially an he was really, I guess, an accountant of trade. He was very, very interested in getting the best prices. And that also comes out in his various paperwork as well. And I think it's also because of that that his archive is so detailed, because he would write down everything, what he paid, the postage, the sending costs, and so on and so on. So really, by the first decade of the 20th century, he had acquired a considerable number of paintings, ceramics, and other artifacts from East Asia, South Asia, and the Near East. And he became known as an influential collector with a good eye for rare pieces. For example, his collection of Chinese painting is considered to be one of the best outside East Asia. And what's also important is that in 1906, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., accepted Freer's gift of bequeathing his collection to the nation. So he basically donated his entire collection, his entire archive, and his library to the American nation. And in 1923, the Freer Gallery of Art opened in a building partially designed by Freer himself. It's also worth noting that it was the first art museum to open on the mall at the time. So it's actually really, Freer was a pioneer in all matters. Now, Freer purchased his first Korean objects in 1986, a few years before he, let me see here, a few years before he retired from his company. His interest in acquiring Asian art was just beginning, and he was yet to be recognized as a leader among Oriental art collectors. He bought these two bowls relatively cheaply at the cost of $5. So that's, these are prices from the time. So $5 for the flower pattern one and $15 for the other, from the newly opened New York branch of Yamanaka & Co. in New York. And I'll talk about Yamanaka & Co. in just a little while. What is the reason why I put the word Korean in inverted commas is because they were sold as Korean. And this, I think, is important because the fact that they were sold as Korean means that Freer would have purchased them as Korean. And it shows that he had an interest in those kinds of pieces. However, now the flower pattern bowl is believed to be from the Qing period, whereas the other bowl is indeed believed to be Korean. The bowls are interesting because they signal Freer's rising interest in East Asian ceramics that was to become a lifelong fascination. And in this, Freer was not alone. He was one of many middle and upper class Americans who turned to ceramic collection as an outlet for their artistic and scholarly pursuits. So, for example, Freer wrote to the New York collector Rufus Moore around this time, "Your references to the delights to be found in the domain of the potter's art have been as yet only partially realized by me, but I must agree with you that there are few mediums surpassing it in fascination." So you can see at this particular time, Freer was beginning to develop an interest in ceramics. We shall see how he then expands this interest, supported by experts as well as dealers. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that for these newly minted wealthy Americans, collecting as an activity or as a pursuit was more than building cultural capital, though that, of course, was a major incentive. But for Americans of this time, devoting time to art acquisition formed part of a social trend that began in the mid-19th century. And it coincided with increased availability of objects from East Asia, including Korean objects. So the interest in art collecting formed part of a broader interest in what at the time was called self-cultivation, self-improvement, that became very fashionable at the time. And I think it's fascinating to see that in connection with that, there were lots of volumes published on how to do that, how to self-cultivate, basically, how to improve yourself, whether it was by acquiring oral skills, engagement in worthwhile activities, such as art appreciation or other kinds of means. It was really about how to become a better man or a better woman. It of course also coincided with the opening of museums and art galleries. So for those people who felt that by engaging in art, they could improve themselves, this of course was really a very attractive outlet. So this idea of self-cultivation coincided with the promotion of hobbies as a means to aid self-improvement and to spend leisure time widely. And when I was doing research for the book, I thought this was actually really fascinating, because I think perhaps it's something we have forgotten nowadays, the idea of having a hobby, and that having a hobby is a good thing. That in particular busy people were encouraged to have. You shouldn't be working all the time. You should also devote time to hobbies, so you could become a balanced person, and actually something perhaps that we can learn a lot from. So from the 1870s onwards, those who decided to pursue collecting, whether it was collecting of art, matchboxes, stamps, anything. There were various art journals and books that supported people in how to do that. And here you see a magazine that was published in America for collectors. And it was first issued in 1889. So these kinds of magazines were really very widespread at the time. Now, if we go back to this question of ceramics, it's clear that ceramics became an increasingly popular focal point for collectors. And by the late 1870s, American collectors of what was called pottery and porcelain were said to number in the thousands. So huge numbers of people collected ceramics. It could be European ceramics, Asian ceramics, really any kind of ceramics. And they would display them in their homes and so on. And it led to the publishing of an increasing number of manuals on the collecting of such pieces aimed at American readers. And the book you see here by William Prime was one of the popular ones. Prime was actually a lawyer and a journalist, but he was also a founding trustee of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So he had these different roles. And you can see here in this particular book here, there are chapters on ancient pottery from Greece, what's now the Islamic world, what's called modern pottery. So that's various kind of European pottery, as well as you can see on the other page here. Oh, this is my cursor here. India, Italy, Danish, Russia. I mean, it's really varied, but also see here a section on China, Korea, and Japan. So this is one of the earliest writings on pottery from Korea. But what is key here is that the text and the illustration, seen from contemporary eyes, doesn't really match. For those of you who have seen Korean ceramics, you may very well question this particular illustration of the so-called Korean water pot. I very much doubt it is Korean, but what's, I think, more important to today's talk is that at this very early time, in the late 1870s, there were discussions of Korean pottery. There were illustrations. people collected what they thought were Korean pottery. And there were lots of debates at the time as to how to define Korean pottery, because relatively little was known about Korea. It should, of course, be remembered that in 1878, this was prior to when America and Europe established trade and diplomatic relations with Korea. That did not happen until 1882 onwards. So there was very little access to the Korean peninsula, and that, of course, made everything much more complicated. So, as I said, like many other early American collectors of Korean art, Freer seemed to gather whichever information he could on Korea from books, as well as personal networks, friends or dealers who knew more about the field than himself. But given the difficulties, we may ask, why did Freer begin to collect Korean ceramics? Why was he interested in that particular field? It seems that his initial Korean art acquisitions follow a larger shift in his collecting activities. So by 1896, when he bought his first Korean pieces, his East Asian pottery collection numbered about 21 Japanese ceramics, and you see some of those pieces here. You may note that they look quite different from each other. So as yet, he was to establish his own taste, and he only had one Chinese ceramic. But following his trip to Japan in the late spring and summer months of 1895, his collecting patterns changed. So this was his first trip to Japan. He stayed for 4 months, and what is fascinating is that his guidebook to Japan is in the Freer Gallery. So you can actually see which sites he visited and so on and so on. You can see it here. We'll go back to the page here. So we know from the guidebook that he was introduced to the Chanoyu, or what Freer called the old-time tea ceremony. And it seems that Freer thought it was wonderful. In Kyoto, he visited the Gingakuji, including the tea room, which he found very, very interesting. And you can see the writing in the guidebook is Freer's own writing. So he wrote here in the pencil, and you can see the text down at the bottom. It says very, very interesting. And he even circled part of the text there. Also, on the other side of the tea room, on the other side of the book, he even sketched the tea room himself. And you can see that he's written Matt's tea room. However, it does seem that Freer did not engage in an in-depth study of the tea ceremony, the history, and the ritual practice. But upon returning to Detroit, he did begin to acquire Japanese tea bowls in increasing numbers. The first being this red raku glazed piece, which he purchased from Tozo Takayanagi in New York in October 1895. Now, Tozo Takayanagi was a small-scale dealer of Japanese art, from whom Freer bought a range of artifacts, predominantly ceramics, between 1887 and 1902. Here, just some details, and actually it's quite fun, isn't it, to see that photograph detailing the Japanese tea ceremony as well. But it seemed that Freer's 4-month stay in Japan, it initiated or it spurred this want for in-depth knowledge of Japanese art. And he increasingly turned to informed and respected dealers to get as much information as he could. So he increasingly began to buy more and more pieces from Matsuki Bunkyo and Yamanaka and Co. Matsuki sold Freer his first piece in 1896. Matsuki Bunkyo is very interesting. By then, he was only 29 years old, very young, but he had already established himself as an expert dealer of Japanese art in America. In fact, a few years earlier, the Japanese government had appointed Matsuki the principal advisor for the selection of commercial and fine art artifacts to be exhibited in the 1893 Chicago Columbian exhibition. So there was this connection between Matsuki, the Japanese government, and the public display of Japanese art in America. However, it was Yamanaka and Co. That exerted the most influence on Freer's East Asian collecting activities. Yamanaka and Co. was founded by the Osaka-born Yamanaka Sadajiro in January 1895. Yamanaka Sadajiro had arrived in America only a few years earlier, but the company was to become a major source through which Freer acquired his Asian artifacts, including most of his Korean pieces. And as I'm sure you all know, Yamanaka, of course, was really the most successful dealer in East Asian art in America and Europe, setting up branches in many cities in America, London, Paris, etc. In 1897, Freer purchased from Yamanaka 10 tea bowls at the price of $50 for each. Now, they were said, or they were sold to Freer by Yamanaka as having originally been in the possession of the Prince of Kaga, who came from the influential Maeda clan of Kaga in Kanazawa, one of the most influential or powerful samurai families in the Edo period. Now, 8 of the bowls were sold as being Korean, and the remaining 2 were believed to be Haggiware. The provenance of the bowls is important, because I think, like many other American millionaires of his time, Freer could not boast of being an aristocrat. But buying artifacts that in various ways connected him to, say, in this case, the Japanese aristocracy, he could create for himself a legacy that that went beyond his financial success and established and gave him a certain credibility. Here you can see the records in the inventory, and there you can see that the handwritten parts here state that they cost $50 each, like this. And here you can also see that it was written in the inventory that they were believed to be Korean as well. And you can also see that the voucher number here suggests that they were all purchased as a group. So it's all the same sale. Again, because we're talking about archives, maybe perhaps I can mention here that the word accepted here means that they were included in the collection that was to be donated to the American nation. So when Freer decided to donate his collection to the American nation, he went through his collection again and again and again and decided which pieces to donate to the nation and which pieces to gift to other people, because he wanted to ensure that only the best pieces entered the museum. So he basically went through his collection and exerted a kind of quality control, which is also noteworthy. In the Chosun period, these kinds of ceramics were made at provincial kilns in Korea, and they were imported to Japan, where Chanoyu tea practitioners used them as tea bowls. In the late 19th century in Japan, these kinds of bowls are typically labeled Godai Jawan. The literal meaning of this, of course, are tea bowls from the Goryeo period, but in actual fact, the bowls were made in the Chosun era. The dealers of Japanese descent, such as Yamanaki and Matsuki, would have known that Godai Jawan would have been highly prized in Japan for centuries. And undoubtedly, it was them who steered Freer's interest to these kinds of bowls and said, this is high quality. It's also very interesting to see that Freer was very much drawn to the color and overall aesthetic appeal of ceramic wares. And that is very much reflected in the archive. So the archive, as I said, was edited several times. So here you're looking at the original typed archive, and Freer would then go through the archive and make further amendments to the description of the wares. So this writing here is actually Freer's own writing. So you can see he's written, the original text would say cream and blue, and then he has changed it there to say rich cream glaze toned with blue. So the change is so detailed. But the fact is that Freer thought it was important to capture that. So these hundreds and hundreds of pages of his inventory all contain such kind of detailed amendments. Down here, for example, you can see originally the record just says yellow, and then Freer has added the word glaze. So it now says yellow glaze, like this. In the case of the bowl I showed you earlier, again, you can see it originally it said pinkish gray with flower decoration, and Freer then changed it saying pinkish yellow glaze with floral decoration in white and brown, right? And it seems he's saying they're hard, I'm looking at splash.
Hash is not a
Hard paste, baby.
I don't know.
Yes, but and then here it says indented bowl white glaze. Indented bowl yes, with glaze. I'm sorry, I should have gone through these again. I was would forget, but anyway, so these are really the fun parts of this archive. So moving on, we may then ask, through which other avenues did Freer purchase Korean objects in the late 19th century? One of the individuals who purchased Korean ceramics prior to Freer was actually this individual here. And I just wanted to share some of the details with you. So Charles Dana was a newspaper owner, editor, and this was how he made his fortune. He was somebody who decided to develop a hobby as a means to self-cultivate, and he built a collection of more than 600 so-called Oriental ceramics. When his estate was put up for auction the year after his death, it generated much excitement. And here is just one of many newspaper articles that talk about this sale. You can see it says their famous collection of valuable porcelains to be sold. It said that in here you can see it says art collectors from all over the country gathered today in the American art galleries, and so on and so on. So there was really enormous excitement. And indeed, Freer also went to the preview and he bid at the auction itself. Several ceramics sold as Korean were offered at the sale. And one of them is, for example, this bowl here. It was sold as old Korean for $27, but it seems likely that it's in fact from the Edo period, from the 17th to 18th century. Another so-called Korean jar are these ones here that you also see. And in the Freer library holds the auction catalog. And you can see that again, Freer has annotated the catalog. And this particular bowl here, he stated was very fine. You can see there in his writing like this. And that he has also noted that it cost $35. It is indeed a Joseon period puncheong bowl, and it probably came to America via Japan as a tea bowl. But it seems that Freer valued this particular bowl much higher because he has written there in the catalog, finest. And you see, he's given it 3 crosses and he's written supreme. It seemed it was originally offered for sale for $75, but that Freer secured it for $50. It's not known why. But this particular gray bowl, dark greenish bowl, is rather curious because its inlaid design of cranes somewhat evoke Goryeo period motifs, but the cloud pattern and the shape of the bowl is not what one would associate with the Goryeo period. In fact, Professor Edward Morse, whom some of you will no doubt know, he was a very well-known American scientist and collector of Japanese ceramics. He studied Freer's artifacts in the 1920s, and he noted, these are his words, rotten, modern, not genuine. Morse's comments on the Korean ceramics were really quite frank. But nowadays, scholars believe that it's most likely what's called a Busan ware, and it was produced in Japan in the 17th century. Now, the question, of course, is where did Dana initially acquire his pieces? It seems that Dana never traveled to East Asia. Probably he bought his East Asian pieces from art auctions held in New York and elsewhere in the late 19th century. And indeed, prior to the opening of of Korea's ports to America and Europe in the early 1880s, it seems that ceramics that were believed to be Korean passed from collection to collection, and in that way circulated the art market. For example, it's known that Dana purchased objects from Francis Brinkley. And Brinkley was this Anglo-Irish newspaper owner, editor, and scholar who resided here in Japan for more than 40 years. He also collected art and wrote about art as well. And at the time, Brinkley was a highly regarded authority on Japanese art. And this is important because Brinkley was believed to be a scholar of Japanese art. His artifacts were trusted. It was believed that you could trust that if he said this piece is Japanese, Chinese, or Korean, that then indeed that was believed to be authentic. So I think this is really important. And here, this is the drawings you see here are from an auction sale of the Brinkley collection that was initiated by this individual called Edward Gray, who was actually British, but he resided in New York. And Edward Gray himself, he was also a specialist on Japanese art and culture. He authored several books about Japan as well. So he too was thought to have scholarly insight into the field. So let's return to the bowl here then. Freer's fondness for this inlaid green glaze bowl that he bought from the Danish sale may suggest that he was drawn to ceramics with subdued, earthy tones. And it may also account for his purchase of this Celadon bowl from Yamanaka, also in 1898. This was bought in the same year. But look at it. It's the inner wall is uneven due to air bubbles. The overall appearance of the bowl is rough. But it seems that Freer didn't mind that, but he thought that it was interesting. Inasmuch as the bowl was labeled a tea bowl, it signifies the manner in which Freer's acquisitions of Korean art increasingly turned to the Goryeo period, to these kind of green glazed wares. Here you can see another bowl from the time. So Freer seems to have increasingly turned from tea bowls to bowls of the Goryeo period. And indeed, from this time onwards, these kinds of green glazed Goryeo dynasty Celadon type bowls came to form the mainstay of his collection. But in many respects, this too mirrors broader trends in the late 19th and early 20th century, whereas the acquisitions he initiated in the 19th century were steered by Japanese connoisseurs' interest in Korean tea bowls, and complicated by the general lack of knowledge on Korean ceramic heritage. In the early 20th century, he began to turn towards high quality Celadon wares that began to enter the market in both Korea and America at this particular time. By the first decade of the early 20th century, several collectors in America were acquiring these kinds of pieces, and it led to increased competition for them. For example, one of those who were collecting Celadon ceramics at the same time that Freer was collecting was this person here, Frank Gare McComber, who was an insurance broker, but he was also connected to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. McComber seems to have succeeded in acquiring a number of high-quality examples, ceramics from the Goryeo period, and he later sold them to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Indeed, I think the general interest in these kinds of ceramics, they tie in with also a shift in Chinese ceramic collection, because at this time, several collectors of Chinese ceramics in America and Europe, they turned away from these very colorful Ming and Qing porcelains in favor of Song Celadon ceramics. So the Ming and Qing porcelains were seen to be decadent and commercial in comparison to the Song ceramics, which collectors such as Freer felt reflected a much more refined and scholarly taste. And I think this also led to the interest in Goryeo ceramics, because you can see, of course, the Goryeo pieces are very similar in shape and in color, in decoration, in technique to the Song pieces. So for collectors who wanted to present themselves as having scholarly insight and having a refined taste, I think the Goryeo ceramics were very popular. This, generally speaking, led to this increased fascination with Goryeo Celadon wares. And indeed, over the course of the first decade of the 20th century, Freer's collecting activities became more focused. He was very keen on securing high quality, choice pieces that furthered the overall quality of his collection. And he would take advice from Yamanaka, who of course was very established, Ernest Fenollosa, whom no doubt you know already. And in 1907, on his second trip to Japan, he was celebrated by the Japanese as a connoisseur of Asian art. So on this trip to Japan, he met with all the influential collectors here in Japan, Nezu, Hara, and so on and so on. He had access to temple collections, etc., etc., etc. And it was on this trip that he made one of his most important purchases of Korean art. And I will tell you about that, and then we will conclude. So he arrived in Tokyo in May 1907, and he then received a letter from Hecker. And Hecker said to him that Horace Allen, the former who served as the minister, US minister in Seoul, he basically had the rank of ambassador in Seoul. So Hecker, his business partner and his friend in America, wrote to Freer in Japan saying that Hecker had received a letter from Allen, and Allen was saying that he was selling his collection of Korean ceramics. Hecker forwarded to Freer a series of letters, and they included this photograph here of Horace Allen's ceramic collection of Goryeo Celadon. And you can see that each piece is numbered. So Allen had also written an inventory of his collection, all 75 pieces. You can see it has a total of 75 pieces, and he had described every single piece. This was the letter that Freer received. That Friedrich Flagg was Allen's nephew. So Friedrich Flagg operated as the go-between. And you can see that Flagg writes here Mr. Allen was United States Minister of Korea, and during a period of 20 years, this collection is now in Toledo, so in Ohio, America, and is for sale. And Mr. Webster suggested that perhaps you would be interested in seeing it and purchasing. He also spoke of dividing the collection with you in case you were interested in the matter. Now, Mr. Webster was a president of an iron and steelswork company in Cleveland. So Mr. Webster was also a collector of ceramics. So it seems that Allen had originally offered it to Webster, and Webster seemed to think he was interested and then suggested to Freer that they split the collection between them. However, a few days later, Flagg sends a follow-up email, and you can see that he's saying here, under separate cover, I enclose you a catalog of the Allen pottery. And he's saying that the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, Sir Purdom Clark, he was the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, are anxious to buy 35 of the pieces, but Dr. Allen wants to sell the whole collection intact. So it seems that by now, Allen had decided he did not want to divide it. He wanted to sell the entire 75 pieces to one person. And that his price is $5,000. The collection is here in Toledo now, etc., etc. Now, the next part is really very interesting because Freer writes to Hecker very fast and says, as you can see here, I've just found time to carefully examine it, buy it. And this is really curious because Freer was in Japan. He had not seen it himself. And only in fact, at this particular time, Freer himself had rejected the opportunity to purchase a rare wooden Buddhist sculpture from Horlyck Temple. I don't know which one, but this so-called rare wooden Buddhist sculpture from Horlyck Temple had been offered to Freer by Yamanaka & Co. But Freer rejected it, and he wrote to Yamanaka & Co., I make it a rule never to buy an object unseen. But in the case of the Allen collection, he immediately says, buy it. Freer's letter to Hecker offers some clues why. It seems that he trusted Allen's description of himself. And here Allen writes, he included this catalog of the collection, and he starts the catalog saying, I have long been considered an authority on this ware. And this collection represents most careful study and investigation during my 21 years in Seoul. There have been no doubt as to the genuineness of each and every ware. The only expert on this ware in America has shown himself most enthusiastic over the collection. And then note the next sentence, Japanese enthusiasts, so Japanese collectors, have made a 6 days journey from Japan to Seoul to view and study the collection. Their enthusiasm never abated when studying the pieces carefully. And I think this was really very important because in Japan, Freer met with these influential collectors who also collected Korean ceramics. There is no evidence that Freer also looked at Korean ceramics with these Japanese collectors, but I think it's highly likely. So here, for example, are just examples of these kinds of Korean ceramics that influential Japanese collectors were collecting at the time when Freer was in Japan. This is the Hara collection and the Nezu collection. The price is also interesting, that Freer says to Hecker, buy the entire collection, $5,000, just buy it. Because in Japan, the most expensive piece of ceramics he bought was this one here, a Korean Goryeo period inlaid jar. And this one piece cost $900. So think about how cheap the Korean collection was, 75 pieces for 5,000. It was a bargain. And Freer knew that, I think. So and indeed, when Freer finally returned to America, he studied the collection and all the pieces he bought very carefully with Ernest Fenollosa in his home in Detroit. And these are Fenollosa's handwriting, nearly impossible to read. But the two of them, they studied together. And Freer wrote in a letter how exciting it was and how happy he was to study it. He said that it gave him much gratification, and he said, I am delighted with the quality of many of the pieces, and I'm interested in all. So he was truly very grateful. Going back to the costs, you can see in the same year he bought from Yamanaka & Co. this bowl and a stand. They are not originally a set, but they were purchased at a set, and they cost $650. So this was really the going price at the time for ceramics. Now, and I can see we're kind of going over time, so I'll conclude here and say that what I've shared with you today are really the beginnings of Freer's collection of Korean ceramics. After he purchased Allen's collection, he continued to purchase Korean ceramics right up to his death. Most of the pieces he purchased after this time were from Yamanaka & Co. in New York. But it's really clear that his purchase of Allen's collection was cemented him as a pioneering collector also of Korean ceramics. As I said, he was among the first generation of East Asian art collectors who took a keen interest in Korean art and who made a very focused effort to obtain high quality pieces with the ambition to build one of the best Korean collections in his existence. And I think he really largely succeeded. He may not have been able to compete with Japanese collectors whose long-standing interest in Korean ceramics, of course, coupled with their close proximity to the peninsula and their easy access to key dealers and objects, they gave them a huge advantage. But by the time of his death, few collections of Korean art in the West matched Freer's in terms of numbers and quality. Among them were Samuel T. Peters, and Peters was a close friend of Freer's. They met very often. There are lots of correspondence with them, but Peters chose to donate his collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I think because he served as a trustee at the museum, it's not known if he donated his entire collection. but certainly his known Gaudio pieces are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In London, Frere's collection is to some extent matched by Aubrey Le Bon's collection. And Aubrey Le Bon donated his collection of Gaudio ceramics to the V&A Museum. Aubrey Le Bon is interesting because he traveled to Korea in the early 1910s and purchased his entire collection in one go there. But another possible contender is Russell Tyson. And Russell Tyson was a shipping magnate, but he began to collect a bit later than Frere. In the late 1910s, Tyson seems only to have begun his collection, and now Tyson's collection is in Chicago Art Institute. I think it's worth noting that, oh, and here you see one of Tyson's pieces. Now, I think the fact that Frere succeeded in building a substantial collection over the course of just 20 years is also noteworthy, and I think is credited his tenacity, his stubbornness, his business mind, but also luck. His timing was perfect. He managed to collect Korean pieces just as the interest in Korean art, and in particular Gaudio Celadon ceramics, was beginning. So he could purchase pieces at a good price, and high quality pieces too. In the early 1910s, Japanese export laws came into effect. There was an increase in prices as well as increased competition. And this made it increasingly difficult to secure choice examples for good money, for good prices. And indeed, over the 1920s, 1930s, and so on, prices continued to increase, and it became very difficult to find genuine pieces, genuine ceramics at good prices, not least since fakes began to enter the market. A case in point may be this piece here, which is now at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It was bought by the museum in 1938, you can see, for $1,000. So quite a substantial sum, but it's now believed to be a possible contemporary make. But at the time when Frere collected his Gaudio pieces, these kinds of questionable ceramics were yet to enter the art market. And that too, I think, was really Frere's luck. So indeed, the question of fakes was a battle that Frere did not have to deal with. And that was the challenge for later collectors to battle with. So thank you very much. I think that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a really fascinating time. I think one thing that's particularly interesting is just getting to see these documents, right? I mean, what an incredible archive to actually have those documents, right? So we have about 20 minutes left. So I have plenty of questions I could ask, but I think first I will ask if anyone in the audience, if any of the students have any questions. どなたか質問があればぜひ、手を挙げる機能を使ってください。
Sorry, I was just wondering, should I put my video on, but see if I can do it. Ah, there we go. And in case.
どなたか質問あるのでしょうか。 While we're waiting for that, I'll ask one question, I guess, particularly in terms of archives or collecting.
Yes.
Right? It's sort of a small question, but I'm just curious, the very detailed amendments that he made to the descriptions of the objects.
Yes.
Show you one. I can. Was this primarily in order to help the records match up with the correct object? Or was there some sort of other motivation? I mean, I don't know if we know what the motivation was, but do you have any sense?
That's an interesting one. I think it was because he was a very meticulous man. That comes out in the archive. And he was very precise in all manner of respects. And I think that's also why you can see he recorded everything, vouchers, not only the objects themselves, but the context of each object. And that's why that the archive, different aspects of the archive interlinks. So say the inventory, you can align or you can cross align with the vouchers part of the archive and so on and so on. And I think it was very important for him to have such precise documentation. So I have a feeling that rather than thinking that perhaps, I guess, the object would get lost from its description and so on, I think it was because he was just very keen to capture it as close as possible, and perhaps also be seen as being knowledgeable of his collection. But you see, it strikes me again and again that he never made changes. I shouldn't perhaps say never, but most of the changes that he made in the archive concern the description. Whereas I can't help but wonder, perhaps nowadays, I wonder whether there would have been more debate on the date.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And
the attribution.
It will exactly the attribution saying 10th century, 11th century, 12th, and so on, and perhaps less focus on the actual description themselves. Because when I trawled through the archive, I kept hoping to see discussion on the dates.
Sure.
But there isn't.
Is it a Korean object? Is it a Japanese object?
Exactly. It's just exactly Korean. And that, I was trying to think, is that perhaps due to the scholarship at the time? But even here you can see it says Korean rather than, to a certain extent, Goryeo, though of course this is a very early record. So, but I would say, I mean, sorry, this kind of gets a long answer to your question, but generally speaking, Freya seemed fascinated by color and the textured surfaces of, in particular, ceramics. And unfortunately, I should have brought a photo here, but I don't know if you've been to the Peacock Room.
Yes, not in a very long time.
No. But for those online who are not familiar with the Peacock Room, I see maybe you could Google it really fast so we can call it up. But the Peacock Room was a room that was lined with paintings made by a British painter whom Freya collected works by, called Whistler. And the entire room is...
If you cancel the screen share.
Oh, okay, let's do that.
Sorry to interrupt.
No. I'll stop sharing here. Yeah, we ought to build it up because it's so beautiful. But, oh yeah, there we go. Oh yeah, and of course, it's, as you recognize it, is from, it's the, I decided to use a photograph of the Peacock Room as the cover of my book. because what happened was that what you're seeing here is a redisplay of the Peacock Room as Freer from 1907, when Freer arranged parts of his ceramics in all the different spaces. So initially, when the Peacock Room was displayed in its original home in England, the original, I guess, collector had put Ming and Qing vases on the shelves. But of course, Freer was not interested in that. So here you can see there are actually a whole plethora of ceramics from early China and Syrian Raqqa wares, Gaudio Celadon wares, and so on. But he does not arrange them according to region, nor according to date, but it's according to color.
Sure.
And that is very clear here. So the Korean ceramics are just here on the right-hand side. But I think, and it goes back to this idea of hobby, because it seems that Freer, like many other collectors of the time, he liked having fun with his pieces,
Sure.
displaying them, redisplaying them. It always reminded me a bit of a doll's house.
Yes.
And just having fun with the aesthetics of it. And then when you get bored, you make another arrangement and you invite your friends in to enjoy it.
It reminds me also of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum.
Yes.
Where she arranged things the way she liked it, right?
Uh-huh.
Again, not according to period or whatever, but according to aesthetics or, you know, what she wanted to juxtapose, what she, you know, and then she ordered that it has to be kept exactly that way.
Right.
So that people can see that display, that arrangement. So, anyway, sorry.
Yes, no, but it's exactly that. And it goes back to this idea of having fun and with a hobby. And I have to say that when I researched the book, I was actually very inspired by that. I think we've forgotten that in many ways, haven't we? And that for these individuals, having fun did not take away the seriousness of their activities. Because I think it's worth noting that the photographs of Freer that he had taken with his objects show him studying his objects.
Sure.
So I think for him, it was really very important to be seen as, to use an old-fashioned word, as a connoisseur, as a knowledgeable connoisseur who built a reputation for buying excellent pieces, also in the region from where his objects were. And it was very important to him when he, for example, visited Japan, that the doors just opened. And that he was recognized, I think, on par with these very knowledgeable and influential local collectors. And he even stayed, I think it was in Mr. Hara's country residence and so on.
Wow.
Yes.
We have a few minutes left. If anyone has a question. 数分まだ残っているので、何か質問があればぜひお願いします。
Yes, in the chat there's
Oh, is there?
Yes. Let me see here. Oh, it's a QR code. Oh, okay, that's fine. Okay, that's fine.
Let me see if I happen to have another small question. I mean, I guess I'll ask about the term Kodai Jawan.
Oh, right. Okay.
Which I'm just curious. I mean, I don't know, maybe we can't really know, but like, I mean, to what extent does the word Kodai just mean Korea, as opposed to meaning either a misunderstanding that you think that it's Goryeo period,
Yes.
or an intentional misinformation that you're
Right.
telling people it's Goryeo period.
Right.
Right.
I think you're right. I mean, I think it predominantly means a Korean piece, and that it's an antique Korean piece. I think that is the way to interpret this particular term.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't know
No,
the
no,
etymology of the history of
No.
exactly how that word
No.
is used in Japanese, but
no,
it was, I guess you happen to know better than I
Yes.
do.
No.
I was curious about that, right?
but you're absolutely right, because the thing is, one of the most confusing aspects of this particular period, the terminology, and to understand what was being sold and what was being purchased. And was the buyer and the seller always in alignment with that?
Right.
But I think you're right in saying that Godai Chawan should be interpreted as meaning old Korean. And indeed, exactly, and indeed, what we see in some of the sales catalogs is that an attempt at dating some of the pieces in English is actually old Korean, which is as vague as it comes.
Right.
Sure. But it's actually not until much later that dates are added to sales catalogs. Yeah.
But of course, to a large extent, maybe people were identifying them as Goryeo
Yes.
period.
Yes.
So I'm not quite sure.
No, but I think you're absolutely right that there is a lot of confusion regarding that. And indeed, of course, it is true that late Goryeo vessels are very akin to puncheonware, or what's now called puncheon.
Right.
Tea bowls that were produced around the time when Hideyoshi invaded the Korean peninsula.
Right.
And that there is a certain overlap. And that, of course, for example, we also see in Freer's own collection too, that those bowls he purchased with these very uneven surfaces and firing bubbles underneath the glaze and so on, that seems to me to imply a want for something antique. And certainly initial interest in the tea aesthetic. And then that changes later on in alignment with also Japanese collectors turning from tea bowls to Goryeo ceramics. So all of that happens at the same time. Yeah.
And everyone's changes in taste are influencing each other.
Yes, I think that too, because of course they spoke with each other, there was also competition.
Right.
I think also amongst friends, in terms of who would get what. And we can, for example, see that somebody like Horace Allen, of course, proudly says the Japanese came to see my pieces, and have pronounced it of excellent quality and so on and so on. That the interesting thing, of course, is as to why he did not sell it to the Japanese.
Right.
And I think it was because of his perhaps political inclinations there, because it's a delicate issue there, but Allen, I think, saw himself as largely pro-Korean.
Sure.
But he was essentially ousted also by both by the Koreans, but also by the Americans in 1904, when the Japanese annexed the Korean peninsula, leading up to the colonial period. And it seemed that Allen's close relationship with King Kojong and the royal family and so on was perhaps seen as a threat and so on. So the American government actually called Allen back and sent his replacement, who then wasn't in Korea for very long, of course, because then the peninsula was taken over. But I wonder whether that was why, because surely if Allen had sold it to a Japanese collector, he could have got I would have thought way more.
Right. Sure.
But there are no records of this. I've certainly never found anything. Alan tried to sell his collection to several individuals who in various ways he knew through his networks, but none of them were Japanese. I have no evidence that he tried to sell it.
Sure. And I don't know anything about Alan beyond recognizing the name.
Right,
But,
yeah, of course.
but if he was close with Emperor Gojong, then I don't know. I think it's easy to believe that he had particular political alignments, right?
Yes.
So,
but as I say, this is, I should say to those online that this is a speculation.
Sure.
And I have, again, talking about lack of archival material.
all right. So I think we're basically out of time. So I'm going to say thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.